Today, we're going to change gears entirely and start looking at what happened to a very different part of the world after the fall of the Roman Empire, way back in 476 CE. Europe, Western Europe. What happened after the Roman Empire fell? So, we're going to look at a time period that has many different names. It's called post-classical Europe because the whole period for the whole world was after the classical period, post-classical. And we're focusing on Western Europe, which is the name of the region in the continent of Europe. You can also sometimes hear this time referred to as the Dark Ages, at least for the first half of this 1,000-year stretch of time. 1,000 years is a really long time. So for the first several hundred years, some people call that time period a dark age because it would have been really unpleasant to live through, and because we don't have a ton of primary sources, so it's kind of dark to history. You can hear this time and place referred to as feudal Europe. Feudal for the feudal system, a land-based economic system that Europe developed specifically in this time period to survive and then abandoned when the time period is over. Sometimes it's called the Middle Ages because it's in between two nicer parts of Western European history that some, often European scholars, would prefer to emphasize. It's in the middle between the classical period, when Europe was great and sophisticated and Rome was big and strong. And then on the other end, the Renaissance, a time of rebirth when Europe, um, became wealthier and focused on the arts and science and progress and, the kinds of things that you see in sort of a golden age. I say sort of because there are also witch burnings. Anyway, we'll get there. So Middle Ages to kind of emphasize that this is a time between two greater periods in history. Similarly, the medieval period or medieval Europe just comes from the Latin for Middle Ages. This 1,000-year stretch of time can really be thought of in three different chunks. The first several hundred years when Europe is really just recovering from the fall of Rome and trying to survive. The middle part of the Middle Ages, when feudalism really takes hold. And then the High Middle Ages towards the end, when Europe starts to kind of drag itself out of this slump and starts trading with the outside world again. And, cities kind of make a comeback and universities get founded. And there are holy wars that are terrible too. So like there's not like a whole lot of great, wonderful, rosy stories unanimously from this time period. But anyway, that's where we're going in this next unit. The framing is the fall of Rome and the consequences that followed from that. We saw that in the Middle East, the Arab Empire rose and thrived during this period in the power vacuum that existed when Rome fell. In Western Europe, we have a very different story. We no longer have an empire, for one thing. If you look at the map on the right, the big one, you'll see a bunch of little different kingdoms, like barbarian kingdoms, if you really want to call it that began to form immediately after the empire was no longer a thing, and then they kind of become the basis for modern European states. In order to understand like why Europe became what it became after Rome, we really have to think through the circumstances and put ourselves in the place of the people who lived through these times. And that means we have to think through what it means when a giant central government that had structured life for thousands of years, like from one day to the next, I mean, not literally, but basically stopped existing. We can start to think about that just in terms of like how people get what they need. On the slide, you'll see a picture of $1. It's worth $1. Unless there's no government, if the government collapses, then it's worth nothing. It's a piece of paper. So one of the consequences of a fall of a major government is the economy gets weird and very different and a lot more based on like barter and trade. Let's put ourselves back in the frame of mind of what it would have been like to lose the Roman Empire. And again, I know that I've gone over this with my class a couple of times, but it's effective, so I'm doing it again. You can think of government in terms of like the power structures that you guys are really familiar with in schools. So imagine pre-COVID, school's normal, we're all there. There are teachers, there's a principal, there's a dean of students, there are rules. Most of the time people follow the rules. When they don't, there are consequences and the adults kind of deal with it. And when there are big problems, you guys, the students, don't deal with it like, adult people who are specialized in these kinds of things do. So if something breaks, y'all don't fix it, someone else does, right? Normal. Schools like this have a culture, a way of doing things, a kind of distinct character that you guys are very familiar with. Now imagine from one day to the next, the adults are all gone everywhere, and you're stuck in the school because it's a mini society. So we're doing a thought experiment. There are no more authority figures. The people who enforce the laws are gone. The people who fix problems are gone. Not only that, but resources are gone too. There's no more delivery of lunches or anything like that. So suddenly all of the kids are left in the building with a limited food supply and like no more on the way. What do you think is going to happen to our society? How long are school rules going to last like that without a government? Without, a school government, if you want, without principals or deans of students or teachers enforcing them? Is school going to be safe anymore? Would anything about school culture feel the same? Probably not, right? Especially given that limited food supply, there's going to be a lot of probably violent competition for resources. And in this context, probably the strongest will thrive. And if you're not strong, but you're smart, you'd probably buddy up with someone who is strong. Probably not everybody would make it. And say this goes on for like a year or two. You're still stuck in school. There's still no adults. Nobody knows how to do anything really. And you're just trying to survive. After a year or two, nobody's going to remember or care why whatever it takes in going to college are written on the walls. Most things about school culture will be a thing of the past. People won't even think about them anymore. Not only that, but like learning will probably stop. You guys already know how to read, which is awesome, and you probably know some basic math, but the younger kids don't. Sixth graders ought to, but you know what I mean. In a situation where you're struggling to survive, you're probably not going to stop everything you're doing and teach other people to read. And anyway, like what for? You can read books all you want, but if you're hungry, that's not your first priority. Then think further, like stuff's eventually going to start to break, and none of you are engineers or plumbers. So what's going to happen to the building? What happens when the bathrooms stop working? You guys still have to go. Where do you think that's going to happen? It's going to get pretty gross. What's going to happen if someone gets sick? Are you guys going to like invent medicine again accurately? Probably not. It would probably be pretty gross and awful. So that's kind of a similar situation. I mean, not exactly what happened when Rome fell, but that kind of thought experiment can help you understand why things went so far downhill so fast in the absence of a strong central government. After the fall of Rome, like immediately after, around the year 500, we had the formation of smaller kingdoms based on tribes that a couple of warlords were strong and could conquer some other places, and so they did, and they formed a little government with kings at the head of the government, and those kings lived in castles, and they had like knights to protect them, and they had peasants to farm the land, and that was kind of it. This was a time of weak kings. So kings didn't have a ton of authority, and as you guys know, probably also from some experience at school, when people in positions of authority are insecure about it, often they rely on pretty heavy-handed punishments to make up for it, which is what, middle-aged kings did back then. So you have medieval torture making an entrance onto the scene. In desperate times, people also tend to try to get a sense of control over their lives, sometimes by turning to faith. So people without hope for any sort of better life in this life began to think a whole lot about the next. So you had a very religious society form. And since it was kind of one of those like the strongest, toughest people survive, you also had, a number of raids, Um, Kingdoms fighting each other, that sort of thing. Vikings. If you play Assassin's Creed Valhalla, you can kind of see some of this, I think. So, violence, chaos, that sort of stuff. Sometimes this time period is referred to as a dark age for a couple of reasons. First, like, it's dark to history. We don't have a ton of sources because nobody was sitting around writing diaries when they were trying to, survive. But also because it was just, compared to Rome, a very much less safe, nice, prosperous time to be alive. The standards of living really went down. Moreover, as you can imagine, an insecure, sort of weak society tends to be very suspicious of outsiders, so very intolerant. There weren't safe roads, so travel kind of didn't really happen so much anymore. People didn't travel very far away from where they were born. Long distance trade stopped. And they developed the feudal system, which is an economy based on like land instead of based on coins, currency, or money. So you trade services, like your work, for the right to live on a certain plot of land, and in exchange you like farm for everybody or you become a knight. So Europe devolves. It's fragmented into many tiny little kingdoms. There's still government, like government still exists. It's just a very weak form of government, and there are lots of different like competing power structures. It's isolated from the rest of Eurasia. It's intolerant of non-Christians, no long distance trade, very superstitious. So you have like big declines in standards of living. And that's kind of the setting for the time period that we're going to expand upon. And so we come to our notes for the post-classical age. Some of you likely have notes on this already when we started Unit 5 on Islamic civilization, because these things occur at the same time. If you didn't take notes then, or if you don't remember exactly how the Islam story is related to the fall of Rome and how the European story fits in, please write this down. The most important thing for you to remember is post-classical period is after the classical period, but before Columbus sails to the Americas. You can see it referred to as the Middle Ages, medieval times, the Dark Ages. Mostly in Europe, you'll see those references. Everywhere else, you should see post-classical period. It begins when the classical empires fall. In Europe, specifically, the fall of Rome set the stage for everything else. And it is characterized by political fragmentation. So where you used to have one big powerful Roman Empire, now you have lots of tiny independent warring kingdoms ruled by weak kings who don't have a ton of power, who rely on the church and on pretty brutal forms of punishment to keep control. You have a Western Europe isolated from the rest of Eurasia, without long distance trade, so completely unaware of all of the diffusion that's going on in the Indian Ocean, for example. They're intolerant of non-Christians, huge declines in standard of living, and very few historical records, especially at the beginning. And so sometimes it's called the Dark Ages. I say sometimes because that's a very judgy sort of way to call a whole period of history, and it certainly doesn't apply to the entire 1,000-year period of history. But maybe it's not a terrible name for the first several hundred years when things might have been pretty dark, especially if you were in Europe.